joined since then. Thank you. Well, okay, welcome everybody to the September 30th installment of the EPAC meeting. As we had discussed on the previous meeting, this meeting is designed to present the results from the sensitivities that have been run so far. The first 3 sensitivities that we've designed under the coordinated grid planning process. You'll remember that we have already presented results of the 3 base scenarios. And now we've run 3 sensitivity cases as well, and those will be shared today. There's a couple of other discussion points that we can hopefully cover a little bit at the end of the meeting, but the key part of this meeting is to go over those results. And we have our NISO colleagues here today to go through that work and present that information to you. So I'm going to hand it over to them in a second, unless there's any questions before we start. Any questions? Okay, in that case, I think I'll hand it over to Keith and let you guys take it away.
Hey, thanks, Skylar. Thanks for that introduction on our presentation here today. The bulk of the presentation today will be presented by Kevin Roberts from the NISO, with myself and Sarah Karkner supporting Kevin as needed to address any questions that are raised during the presentation of the slides today. With that, Kevin, take it away.
Thank you, Keith. I'll get those slides up. Just give me one moment here. Sorry about that, getting there. Okay, I think I've got these slides up. Just doing a mic test and a screen test. Can y'all see these slides here and hear me?
Yep.
Kevin, we can hear you and the slides are visible. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so today we will be presenting CGPP sensitivities 1 through 3. And the agenda that we are going to be covering is starting with a sensitivity overview and assumptions. And then we'll get into the sensitivity results and we'll do a comparison and analysis of, there's 3 sensitivities, but they fall under 2 main categories. One of them being a copper sheet analysis and the other being a alternate defer assumption. So just to give an overview of the sensitivities in general, so we'll be going through the first 3 that we have done for the CGPP process. In general, the sensitivities are used to examine the impact of changes, and these are changes that are identified by the joint utilities to the specified CGPP scenario and the assumption for that scenario. And the assumptions, I'll get into those in more detail on the next slide. But the request for these sensitivities and assumption details were provided by the joint utilities, and this is continuing the capacity expansion modeling after the work that was done for the main CGPP scenarios 1 through 3. So there's a little bit of a terminology piece to just clarify. We have scenarios, which is state scenario, and then we had scenario 2 and 3, which we previously presented at EPAC. And now we're getting into sensitivities. And the current plan with the joint utilities is to perform a total of 10 sensitivities. So you may see more of those at future EPACs. And as with previously provided capacity expansion results, we focus on the capacity and generation for these incremental model years. So here we have a table of the specific sensitivity assumptions. And sensitivity 1 and 2 falls under the umbrella of a copper sheet. And so a copper sheet is where we perform a bulk relaxation within the capacity expansion model. And what that means is any sort of bulk transfer limits that we have within the model, representing interfaces like Central East or Dysinger East, et cetera. We have those in our model in normal scenarios with transfer limits, meaning we can only flow so much energy from one zone to another through these bulk interfaces. And so when we do the relaxation, we're saying that limit is now is taken away. The energy can be freely flowed over the state. And so that is what the copper sheet is. And with sensitivity 1 and 2, there are slight differences between what else was removed or changed within the model to look for this analysis. So in sensitivity 1, we actually do the copper sheet with no LCR. And so that's the locational capacity requirement, which means that certain capacity needs to be built in downstate zones like G through J, or just J itself and K. So in sensitivity 1, we actually eliminate that LCR requirement. And that also leads us to removing the locality ELCCs. So anything to do with an LCR is removed in the first sensitivity here. And in the second sensitivity, we preserve the LCR. So the need for capacity downstate is still a requirement within the model, and you still have those locality ELCCs, and that's all consistent with assumptions in the state scenario. So you really are only getting the bulk relaxation or the copper sheet in sensitivity 2. And then sensitivity 3 is different than 1 and 2. It's unique in that it is only looking at alternate defer assumptions. So all the assumptions are consistent with the state scenario, with the exception of the defer options. And with this sensitivity, we are now including a high capital, low operating cost defer option. You'll see it abbreviated as HCLO, high capital, low operating. And secondly, we have the hydrogen fuel cell as an option in this sensitivity. And that is the fuel cell option that we have seen in scenario 3 that we already performed for CGPP. So that hydrogen fuel cell option is returning in sensitivity 3. And just to note that this sensitivity does not include the hydrogen combustion defer option at all. So it doesn't have the new or retrofit hydrogen option. It is just the high capital, low operating and the hydrogen fuel cell. And I have details on this sensitivity, more details on the next slide here. So I'll go to that. So just providing more details on the alternate defer sensitivity here. So as I mentioned, you got your high capital, low operating defer option. And just to specifically call out, this defer option is not hydrogen based. And other specific assumptions here, this option is only being allowed to be built in zones A through G, and it can only be built beginning in 2037. It doesn't have any sort of specific block size or capacity limit assumed to it. And the cost assumptions are coming from the 2024 NREL annual technology baseline. And the specific costs are listed here in the bullets. And any other assumptions like fixed and variable O&M costs that aren't specified in the previous bullets here are taken from the NISO's Outlook study that we just performed. In the Outlook, there is a high capital, low operating resource, and any fixed and variable O&M costs for the high capital, low operating in this sensitivity are coming from the same assumptions that come from the Outlook. And that includes any other characteristics that are also not specified. We just use the assumptions from the Outlook. And if you're interested in understanding those more fully, we have the links for Outlook appendices here. And then,
question?
yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Bill Ackern, Beth, just a question. The capital costs coming from the 2024 NREL annual technology baseline, which baseline was that? What were they pulled from? This is representing a collection of possible technologies. So I'm just curious how you pulled that.
Okay, I see your question, Bill. Skylar, do you mind if I ask? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we have a couple of data sets on nuclear costs and long duration storage costs and other resource costs that all fall under a similar range of resource costs from like $5,000 to $7,000 per kilowatt, with varying, fixed and variable costs. But we didn't have any like one specific forecast for the decline in long duration storage costs. But what we were able to find was a recent NREL technology baseline for nuclear costs, that all those annual costs fall within the range that we found for all three of the technologies options. So we just basically took that as a kind of a representative cost decline for technologies within that range of costs. So the sub bullets here that say like 2037, 6,900, those come from the 2024 NREL nuclear forecast.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is where they might diverge by that point. The projections I've seen for long duration storage are a bit lower than that. So something we may want to keep in mind going forward. See if I can get you some better numbers for that. But I'd be curious. I don't know if you would have a sense as you present the results, of how much effect that is going to have on things. But it may be something we want to take a look at further.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we've seen for long duration storage are mostly targets for like high capacity and like high manufacturing capability. Once they kind of reach that learning, that might happen by the end of those 2030s for a number of these technologies. But even these costs here for something that might be able to discharge for say 100 hours, this basically represents something between $60 and $70 per kilowatt hour installed cost, and multiply that by the 100 hours, per kilowatt. That gets you to this, 6,900 down to $6,000 per kilowatt. So it's kind of in that $50 to $75 per kilowatt hour range for an installed cost of like a 100-hour long duration storage resource. If we're looking at things that are more mechanical in nature, that might be even cheaper per unit, or things that are shorter than 100-hour duration, the costs they vary very widely.
Right.
And so that's something we'd want to incorporate, which is probably why you proposed doing sensitivities that look at like something like 16 or 24 and 100-hour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
But we would love any other data or sources on that as we kind of look to cycle 2 or future sensitivities that might have better costs. That would be great.
Good. Thanks.
All right. Thank you,
I
Skylar.
think I
Thank
saw
you.
one more hand come up while we were talking. Is that? Let me scroll through.
Right.
Raya? Okay. Yep.
Raya, thank you so very much. And thank you, Skylar. That was a very helpful explanation you gave. That's my question, is if could we make sure that these slides or the presentation is express about how nuclear is baked in? Because I didn't see, the word, just whatever's happening. On the slide before, I didn't see the word, nuclear. I saw hydrogen. So I guess that's my question is how is it baked in, and just can it be expressed, what you just sort of explained, Skylar, be expressed in the documentation so folks can follow along.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that probably makes sense anyway, right here under that cost bullet. We would say something more along the lines of uses the capital cost data from the nuclear baseline to represent the cost, the average cost for nuclear and long duration storage on a capital cost basis. Yeah, just to make it more explicit.
Yeah, and also if I'm just, because it is actually modeling, because nuclear is actually being modeled, correct? It's going to be nuclear kind of paired with this long duration storage, or clarify for me.
Oh, yeah, sure. So the way the model's seeing it, it needs to pick a cost for a resource that can be dropped in. The model doesn't know whether it's, long duration storage or nuclear in any given, resource block that it's choosing. It'll choose something at this cost to drop in a certain area, a certain zone, and then the model will choose to dispatch that resource at its capabilities. And so both nuclear and long duration storage in the model would basically be able to discharge at their full capability for an entire day. So the model doesn't actually know whether it's long duration storage or nuclear because they would show up the same in both the investment decision and the dispatch decision, the way the model is currently set up. We hope to be able to, in future cycles, have the capability to kind of string days together to where things like nuclear and long duration storage would look different in the model. Because for nuclear, you could just dispatch it and just keep it running throughout the whole model. Whereas long duration storage, you could do that for a few of those days. Then you're going to have to go back and charge it in a different off-peak time. But the model doesn't see that right now. So that's kind of a big difference that we're hoping to solve in future cycles.
All right, thank you. I think so, yes, as long as, if you could please make sure that this is expressed in the text, just so folks can understand.
Hey, Skylar, it's Keith. Just want to speak up on that nice point of including the word nuclear. We would leave that up to DPS staff or the joint utilities to figure out an appropriate posting for that. The purpose of these slides are to explain the results. We were not given a clear statement in writing exactly what was intended by these high capacity, low operating DFIRs to represent in the scenario description to the NISO. So we look for that to be explained through other means rather than in the NISO presentation. Thank you.
No, that's a good point. And we can definitely have a broader explanation of that in the reports that come out of this as well.
All right, this is helpful. I just so that there's just some documentation of where we are in this process with this. I wouldn't want it to go, through the cracks. I get there's some, it sounds like maybe some catching up to do in terms of where something will be reported out, but I just think it's important that folks understand what's being modeled with regards to this in the near term, and not sort of, I guess that's my ask, in the near term, as opposed to, I don't know when those reports are coming out, Skylar. That could be a month, 6. I get that there's
Definitely.
a thing. Okay, all right. I don't have a
Definitely lag
solution
there.
right now, but all right. It just seems, I guess that's the ask, is that we make sure that there's a place for this to really be fully understood.
Sure. Yeah. And we can make that request and see if we can update the slides with that extra sentence or two, so people are aware of like what specific technology costs we're using and what specific technologies the model is kind of seeing here when it's picking.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, Skylar, I think I need to be forcefully clear here. We're DPS needs to put that in a statement that they come out with, not on NISO slides, please.
Got it. Thanks, Keith. Julia, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. So I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this is combining two of the scenarios that we discussed last time, which is the like high-low operating long duration storage / nuclear, and the no DFIR in zone J, because I see this as A through G. And I feel like those are two different things. Like, I think one of the concerns with zone J with the DFIRS as the combustion and the transportation of hydrogen in theory. And, you know, long duration storage maybe is a good application in zone J. Nuclear is maybe more complicated, but I'm just like curious if that's combined here or if folks think it's like makes sense to have them as two different scenarios.
No, that's a great flag. I should probably be a little clearer here. This scenario did aggregate a bunch of scenario proposals, but there's going to be a separate discussion of a future sensitivity that would look at changing the way DFIRs are done downstate. This is just taking the proposals that we had to do long duration storage if we can, you know, represent something that looks like long duration storage, represent something that might look like nuclear, and remove combustion, the basically quote unquote free retrofit combustion resource from downstate, just to make sure that like the model is seeing a price for doing hydrogen. And in this scenario, we're not preventing the fuel cell resources from being downstate. The fuel cell resources can still be anywhere in the state. It's just these new high capital, low operating cost resources that are restricted to zones A to G. So this is kind of like a blend of 4 or 5 of those scenario proposals, but there's a separate set of proposals that's being looked at as a sensitivity that basically eliminates any form of hydrogen DFIR in downstate New York and allows for different resources in the rest of the state as well. So that's something that's going to come separately.
Got it. Thank you. That makes sense.
Any other questions on this, the setup before we move on?
Hey, Skylar, this is Shadab Ali from NextEra.
Hi, go ahead.
Hey, sorry, I'm new to this forum, so I may be asking a trivial question here. But I thought in one of the presentation before I saw, you know, where you guys were modeling resources based on the economical analysis, you know, and I think you were showing that, you know, putting generation more in the upstate, even after building transmission, is more economical than putting more expensive resources downstream. So I'm wondering, like, are you going to compare scenarios at some point where, like, what is the most economical solution and practical solution?
So we have a number of things going on here. So we have 3 base scenarios and a bunch of sensitivities, and each of those individual modeling runs is being done in a capacity expansion model that is doing exactly what you're saying. It's trying to choose resources across the state, including any additional, you know, costs to build that extra headroom. It's comparing those costs across the whole state and trying to build out a suite of generation resources that meets all of the requirements and constraints we're putting on the model, including our load forecast and all of the decarbonization requirements from the CLCPA. So that's happening in each individual model run. But we also have, I think the NISO's done a great job on some of the presentations they've given to EPAC, and most of those are posted to the EPAC website, where there's a slide kind of comparing the various scenarios together and how the different assumptions kind of result in more or less generation in given areas. So those might be some information that'd be interesting to post, and I'm not sure, but Kevin or Keith, there might be some kind of comparison slides in this presentation as well.
Yes,
Does that
that's
answer your
right.
question? Oh, thanks, Kevin. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you. So one more follow-up question on the nuclear. Is it what technology are you modeling for nuclear?
So the technology baseline costs that we took were from the NREL's large nuclear plant forecast.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands, Kevin, so I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thanks very much. All right, if there are no other questions on the assumptions for the cases, I'll go ahead and get into the results here. So first, I'm going to go over the results for the copper sheet cases, and then we'll get into the alternate DFIR case separately. So on the copper sheet case, we want to begin with some important conclusions just to level set some things with this analysis. The capacity expansion results for these copper sheet sensitivities are not showing significant change relative to the state scenario. And it's primarily due to some assumptions that we have for the technology candidates. So just even taking that at a high level, again, when we remove the transmission constraints and energy is allowed to flow freely across the state, we're not seeing a ton of change because the model needs to still meet certain requirements. First, it needs to build enough capacity, it needs to serve energy, and it needs to respect all of the other constraints that we have in the model. And that could be related to CLCPA, like the 70/30 or the 0/40. And it also has to respect the technology assumptions that we have and the limitations it has there. So getting into that more specifically, when it comes to our candidate technology of a land-based wind, for example, the land-based wind is already limited by the large-scale resource or LSR supply curve that we use as an assumption in the model. So the model is choosing to max out the land-based wind resource in both the state scenario and these copper sheet sensitivities. So that means that there's not really any other distribution that is possible. And just for the record, more information on the supply curve, we have a link that's posted on the EPAC website if you want to look at that further. But so land-based wind is constrained. And also on the utility scale solar, this is also limited by an annual build limit that we have in the model. It's a 2.5 gigawatt per year build limitation. So the model cannot build more UPV in each copper sheet sensitivity. And that's also included, that limit is also reached in the main state scenario. So UPV is limited. And the model is already economically optimizing this resource based on the zonal capital costs and headroom as well. So we've got two resources that are limited. And then when we get to offshore wind, this is not limited by any sort of annual build limit. It does have a limit based on the LSR supply curve, but neither of those limits are being reached in the model. But what we do have is the model is required to build 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. That's per the CLCPA requirement. And then additional builds beyond 2035 are also limited by economics. But because the model is limited with respect to land-based wind and UPV, the model does choose to build more offshore wind and batteries because it has to serve capacity and it has to meet capacity needs and it has to serve energy requirements. And then when we get into like the hydrogen resource, when it comes to these copper sheet cases, the model did not add more new hydrogen because of the cost assumptions. And there's also the electrolysis constraint. So the model, if it chose to add more hydrogen combustion, it also has to add more electrolysis. And that's a pretty significant and costly constraint in the model. Now, the ability to add batteries is not limited by the supply curve and is generally not constrained. So really, when we get into these results, you'll see that battery has a lot of flexibility to move around and be built in other zones. But when it comes to all of these other resources, we're not seeing a lot of movement because of all the other constraints. So getting at the sort of big conclusion here, the final conclusion is that for both of these copper sheet sensitivities, the new generation capacity expansion additions are constrained by these build limitations rather than the bulk transmission constraints. So for that reason, the full impact of relaxing the bulk constraints is not readily apparent from these sensitivity results. So we just want to place that information up front because it is difficult to conclude anything on the bulk relaxation from this. So I'm happy to field any questions on that if there are any at this moment. Otherwise, I will sort of highlight this point as I get into the more detailed results.
Hey, Kevin, is that construction in your background?
Yes, it is.
All right.
Is it?
Now that we know it's not somebody else, okay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. If it becomes obnoxiously loud, unfortunately, I cannot do anything about it. So let me know. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep going though. So on the copper sheet no LCR case, we have some key findings. Sensitivity 1 is showing that there is no, and we're talking at the NICA level now, there's no significant change in the total resource build by technology type. And at the zonal level, the results show mostly a shifting of battery resources from downstate to upstate. And this shifting from downstate to upstate is due to the removal of the LCR constraint. And then the final bullet on this is just mentioning that the expansion candidates are limited from other assumptions, and it leads to limited redistribution of resources when bulk transmission is relaxed. And then on sensitivity 2, where the LCRs are preserved, again, there's no significant change in the total resource build at the NICA level. And at the zonal level, we have batteries being redistributed, and there's just more flexibility when it comes to using battery to serve energy needs, LCR, and even the optimization of headroom. But again, it's very constrained on each capacity candidate. So here's what this looks like at a NICA level. This is kind of the classic installed capacity figure that we have on top and the generation figure we have on the bottom. And then we have sensitivity, the results for sensitivity 1 and sensitivity 2. But really, these look very similar, and we even present these as a delta slide. So again, just each sensitivity with respect to as a delta to the state scenario. And again, there isn't a lot to highlight here. There's not a significant change at the NICA level. And then at the upstate versus downstate level, sensitivities 1 and 2 are showing little change in the upstate versus downstate distribution, with the exception of shifting of batteries in sensitivity 1 from downstate to upstate. And that's because there is no LCR forcing more capacity to be built downstate.
Yeah, can I just reinforce that last point?
Yep.
If you go back one slide, yeah. So when you're looking at especially that left side in sensitivity 1, without LCRs, as Kevin was saying, and with a fully kind of copper sheet assessment being done in the capacity expansion model, this is a run that basically says you can put a battery in Syracuse, and when it kind of injects power, it can also inject power into New York City. So it's like it can charge from anywhere and discharge to anywhere, because basically any generation resource can serve any location. When you think about it kind of that way, I think it's even more surprising initially that we don't see a bigger change in things like, defer builds or wind or solar. But as Kevin kind of went over earlier, we're already building such a tremendous amount of additional capacity where we are able to, because based on the supply curve assessment, where we can actually physically access generation resources, is already so constrained. We're not really even seeing, even having infinite basically deliverability to anywhere in the state, we're not really seeing much difference in generation resources. With storage, though, it's providing that capacity and the ability to shift wind and solar energy to different times, and that's where storage can bounce around a bit. I think that my biggest takeaway so far, though, has been kind of sensitivity 2, and that when you put those LCRs back in, even basically having infinite kind of bulk transferability between zones, it doesn't change the generation mix compared to our scenario 1, the state scenario here. And I think that's just kind of a huge takeaway and points to a lot of other things going on in our modeling framework and in just the kind of the stringency of our targets and restrictions on our build outs that we're facing that are really kind of limiting the ability of this capacity expansion model to show us a lot of value in that kind of bulk interface relaxation. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks for those points, Skylar. And I think that'll be some of the stuff you mentioned on battery will even be further highlighted in some of these next slides here. So when we look at it specifically at the zonal level, you can see a lot of similarity between the cases, but then again, highlighting how really when we get changes, it's with respect to battery. And we also have this presented in a delta form, which is also an interesting way to look at it. So this is the zonal build delta with respect to the state scenario. And in sensitivity 1 with no LCR, you really see that that shifting from downstate to upstate. So that's fairly apparent from this case. But then when you get into sensitivity 2, you are seeing a sort of more optimized version of the case with solar and battery, but you don't get an apparent shifting because the LCR is still in place here.
I think
So
we
then-
have a question on the phone.
Yeah.
You can mute while, you should try to mute while somebody else is talking.
Yeah, go ahead, Radhika.
Oops, did I make it work worse?
Well, no, I thought I saw Radhika's hand up.
Maybe not.
Did see Radhika. Maybe we lost her,
Yeah.
but we do have somebody else. Rand here.
Yes, hi. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
So this, my name is Randy. I work at VO, Vineyard Offshore. I had a question regarding, I guess it's a broader question as to how the phase angle regulators were treated in the study. Were they totally relaxed, or were they still in the same schedules or the dispatch levels that we've always had them generally at?
Hey, Randy, this is Keith from the NICE. I'll take a crack at that question. The model that we're using here is a pipe and bubble transportation type model for capacity expansion. The details of like a PAR behaviors, something that would show up under your more detailed transmission security analysis or production cost analysis. So that's not really an aspect that's a factor here on that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Thought I saw another hand up.
Yeah, this is Shadab again. Can you confirm if you relax the bulk transmission constraint for this analysis?
That is confirmed for both this sensitivity 1 and sensitivity 2. So the bulk system constraints are represented by limitations in the model based on transfer limit analysis. You can see those limitations in past presentations on the CGPP or in the NISO Outlook. So effectively, what a copper sheet is taking those bulk limitations and assuming you have infinite capability of your bulk transmission system. So infinite limit or effectively no limitation on there.
Okay.
And that is
Okay.
true only for these two sensitivities, or refer to them as copper sheets.
Okay, and is that consistent with the CGPP order? That assumption to relax the bulk
So that is consistent with this, the request for sensitivities or sensitivities allowed to be included in here. I think Skylar might be able to opine a little bit more on the CGPP order, but there is some language in there about evaluating bulk constraints. And this was, these two sensitivities, these copper sheets, were done specifically for that specific call out for sensitivities.
Yeah, that's
Skylar,
exactly
anything to
right,
add there?
Keith.
Yeah.
No, that was perfect. The order does mention that one of the key aspects of some of the sensitivities is to test the differences in resource mix and needs under different bulk relaxation scenarios. So these were the first two to start with, where you're basically just relaxing the whole transmission system across the whole state, one with LCRs and one without LCRs enforced, just to see, what changes are we seeing under bulk relaxation. So this is kind of the minimum we'd want to do in terms of testing bulk kind of constraints in the capacity expansion model. I think what we learned from these first two is that there's so many other restrictions binding on the resource availability and build rates and locations that the bulk transmission relaxation doesn't have much it can do for us at the moment, without looking kind of more detail about very granular specific locations of where there's a high resource potential, probably more granular than this capacity expansion model can see, just to see where specifically what regions those renewables will probably show up at, and kind of combining those kind of local and bulk type solutions into one to really give a better sense of what those solutions can actually do for us, because just kind of relaxing general bulk limitations isn't showing us a huge difference.
Thank you. That's helpful, Skylar.
Yeah. Ryan, did you have a follow up there?
I did. I'm glad you brought this up, and I'm hoping we could, when you ran a more detailed scenario analysis, we could pick this up. One observation that we've had is that we find that post the Long Island PPTN, a lot of the constraints are still held for the Long Island system. So Long Island is still restricted from exporting power, but with the PPTN and the offshore wind that's coming there, that constraint should be relaxed significantly. But that doesn't happen, and if that doesn't happen, then you tend to see a lot of overloads in K. So I'm just wondering if we could further sort of incorporate that going forward in the detailed analysis.
Okay, yeah, I think in this in the transmission representation that we have, at least here in the capacity expansion model, I believe we did include the added transfer capability that should come along with the Long Island PPTN. We're not necessarily going to be able to see the granular impact of that increase, like on an hour-to-hour basis, and the congestion and all those issues that are really important to things like offshore wind deliverability and storage charging, those types of things. We're not going to be able to see that in terms of these capacity expansion model results. But I'm wondering if someone from the utilities would want to jump in here and kind of talk briefly about how the additional capability from the PPTN representation might flow through the rest of the stages of the CGPP when we're doing kind of that local modeling, where this is going to be a lot more, easily represented and a lot more relevant, I think. Is there anyone from the utilities who could kind of talk through how, that type of a added project would flow through the rest of the CGPP modeling?
Hi, Skylar. This is Hal from PSE Long Island. So for the Zone K PPTN project, awarded per PPTN project, it has been already included in the base case. That the incremental headroom on top of that has already become assumed in the base case at starting year 2030 for the capacity expansion plan. And for our kind of ongoing effort on the CGPP on the state phase 2 for the base case model, we already include that starting year 2030 as well.
Great. And so when we're going through those more detailed, like physical models and the stability analysis and the power flow analysis, we'll be able to see a little bit more detail about how that's impacting, you know, the system and injections from various resources at that time.
Okay, thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Sorry, I had the audio issues earlier. I wanted to clarify that the other copper sheet analysis is still being done on the removing the local headroom as well as the bulk headroom. And I don't know about the LCR limitations, but at least the combination of bulk and headroom, is that still in the planning to do that analysis?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. That's something we're going to kind of discuss at the end. There's other sensitivities kind of in progress, and this is one I think you may have suggested. You know,
Yes.
with these types of runs, we weren't sure what we were going to get, but knowing that local headroom and the supply curve build rates seem to be really binding here. That other sensitivity is going to kind of educate us more on, you know, what happens if those are also relaxed. You know, are we expecting bigger, you know, changes in build outs when those kind of constraints that are clearly limiting the ability of the bulk relaxation to do much? See what's happening there. So those are results that we'll be able to bring back to a future EPAC meeting. So yeah, that's a separate sensitivity that's going on.
Okay, thank you. And one question on this scenario. So just to confirm our understanding, there appears to be minimal changes because the renewable build is already reaching that limit, 2.5 gigawatt of solar. So the model stops building solar each year once that limit is reached. And then for wind, it's the same. You get to the max. And the headroom values, you are not changing the headroom values, correct? Or how?
That's correct. For both of the sensitivity 1 and sensitivity 2 with copper sheet, there was no change to the headroom assumption.
Okay. So they are the ones that were used in the state scenario, the initial
Exact same ones that were used in every scenario and sensitivity so far. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. I think we can go back to the slides now.
All right, thank you. And just to continue on the headroom conversation, the same assumptions with respect to existing headroom are in each case. The model does have the ability to optimize the additional headroom that it does build. So the results of that added headroom optimization are here for each of the copper sheet sensitivities, but really it's a very similar result. It does show some redistribution of added headroom, mostly in the upstate zones. And then for the sake of just being consistent with other data we've provided, the copper sheet cases, we have the 4-hour storage and 8-hour storage by zone. So again, you can see that shifting occurring or not occurring when the LCR is preserved. Other than that, not a significant change here. And then on the hydrogen build by zone, by type, we see that the LCR, without LCR, it eliminates the need for new hydrogen D-free units. That's specifically the solid purple bars here. We do not see the need for those when we eliminate LCR, but it does choose to build those in the case where LCR is preserved. And But the retrofits are still preserved or preferred in both of these cases because they are still economic. You know, they're basically like a free resource option. So
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. And this points back to, I think, I'm not sure Bill's here anymore, but one of the things that Bill had suggested, and we're building into this next sensitivity that's about to be presented, is this decision making the model has, where we're basically providing them this free option to retrofit existing resources, and it's doing that even when the LCRs are removed, and you don't necessarily have to put anything at higher cost within Zone J. It's still choosing to retrofit things in Zone J because it's cheaper than building something new elsewhere. And I think there was a suggestion by multiple stakeholders that we're trying to build into this next sensitivity to kind of look at more detail and make sure there's more cost represented to do that. So it's not just so easy for the model to do essentially low cost or free retrofits.
all right, thank you, Skylar. And with that, that covers what we had planned to go over for these copper sheet cases. And unless there are any other questions, I'm going to get into the alternate defer assumption sensitivity.
Hey, Kevin, looks like we have one from Radhika.
Got it.
Sorry, one question on the incremental headroom slide. When you look at the incremental changes from the state scenario, it does seem to suggest that there is need for increased headroom in Zone E, for instance, compared to the state scenario. So that seemed to suggest that something that relaxing the bulk interface allows more renewable in Zone E. So to me showing some benefits of bulk increase and how I just want to, I think that's how you would interpret some of this data, but I wanted to gauge everyone reading of this chart in particular, because I do see some increases in incremental headroom, Zone A as well a little bit. Zone C seems to decrease, which is a little counter, but maybe Zone E is replacing the need for Zone C. But it does seem to suggest that allowing more at the bulk level, at least in Zone E, is resulting in more local headroom, but because the combination of local headroom and generation, it's optimum in this case.
I think that's in general, I think that's the takeaway here. Like if you have none of those bulk interface limits between these zones, the model is picking like basically 1,000 megawatts less in Zone C and maybe 500 megawatts less in Zone D and shifting those megawatts to zones A, B, and E. So it is kind of shifting around about 1,000 or 1,500 megawatts between those upstate zones. The one thing I'd caution though is that we don't know whether that shifting happens economically based off of 500 megawatts relaxation, 1,000 megawatts, or this infinite relaxation that we allowed for. So we don't necessarily know without even more sensitivities and tweaking of those relaxation limits how much it takes to make this switch happen. And just in general, when we're talking about building 70 or 80 gigawatts of renewables across the state, shifting around 500 megawatts in a zone to Zone E is kind of a small change just in general. It's big because that's like 2 or 3 very large energy infrastructure installations, but I'd say in general it's still kind of a relatively small change.
Yes, that's a great point. Relatively, it's a small change, and maybe like in absolute values though, like when you look at those incremental headroom, and we see that in the state scenario, so this is a valid going for the main scenario as well. Like an incremental headroom of 7 gigawatts, that's a lot of incremental headroom. And it does suggest that achieving this level of additional transmission headroom might be a combination of high voltage and low voltage solution, because I mean at those levels, even 3 gigawatt, that's a lot of headroom. So
Yeah.
given that those sensitivities are to explore the benefits of high voltage bulk solution, maybe we also need to consider the absolute values of those incremental headroom even in the state scenario, because to achieve those increments of headroom, incremental headroom, it does take a lot of transmission. So maybe we also, I'm kind of like thinking out loud here, but maybe there is also needs to be consideration of how this incremental local headroom could be achieved, because those are very high values, large values, gigawatt values.
I think that's spot on. You know, no matter what we do, even when there's tons of transmission constraints or none, no matter what, we're building like 20,000 megawatts of this additional headroom. And I think if you ask any of the utility personnel, they would say that is a lot of local headroom. And specifically, you know, exactly where that goes might change a little bit here based on, you know, what our bulk interface limits are. But that might speak to exactly what you said, these hybrid solutions where some of the most impactful things would be those on-ramps or those headroom areas to kind of, you know, find ways to get, you know, 3,000 to 7,000 megawatts of new headroom in a given zone. So I agree. That's definitely something we should look into, and hopefully that next scenario might give us a little bit more, or that next sensitivity rather might give us some more information about that, the one that doesn't have those types of headroom limitations. And just the last thing I'll say on this is that, you know, in these scenarios and sensitivities, it's building 7,000 megawatts in zone E, even with the kind of exponentially increasing headroom cost. So that just tells you a lot about where the supplies are available, where supplies might be cheaper, and that's just something we're going to have to take into account when we're kind of crafting future sensitivities and, you know, designing solutions long term.
I'm glad to hear that, because I think seeing those results of the sensitivities, maybe the approach for bulk needs to be considered also from this, not only bulk sensitivities, relaxing the interfaces, but maybe even how do you achieve this level of headroom, and could be responses on multiple sides across multiple processes.
Yeah, thanks. Next hand.
Hey, quick question on the LDS and its impact. Will you also be considering the impact of extreme weather when you are developing these resources for future?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We have gotten that question in the past when we're trying to design these sensitivities in the capacity expansion model. I think at this stage, we're in stage 1 of the CGPP, just running kind of capacity expansion analysis to see what generation is likely needed under a variety of conditions. We're not testing kind of extreme weather events or, you know, extreme weather seasons. For example, we're kind of taking those average weather years that have been kind of baked into the load forecast through the Climate Action Council scoping process, and we're using those forecasts for load here. There may be an ability in future stages to test either through production cost modeling or something else to kind of test these various build outs under extreme conditions like extreme weather events or an extreme weather year or something like that. But that's not something that's built into stage 1 of the CGPP at the moment.
Thanks. Now I'm not as concerned about the impact on load, but I'm concerned about the duration of the extreme weather event. As you know, those are multi-day event.
Mhm.
And even, 4-hour, 8-hour storage may not be enough to survive those events. And we just did a presentation on 1920 in PJM. I know this is not a 1920 order discussion, but that order 1920 requires extreme weather sensitivity for a reason. And I think whatever come out from this discussion is probably going to have impact on transmission. So I think I would highly encourage to consider the extreme weather impact, not only from the load and resource, but also like the duration. Do we have resources that can support a multi-day event?
Yes, that is a great point. We have also noted that in 1920, we think it's a great idea. We've been planning to address that in various stages of CGBP, but I think calling out more explicitly and evaluating that is going to be really essential in the future. I mean, I think we all saw what just happened in the South over the last few days, and the grid and other resources are going to be challenged by extreme events. So that's definitely something we need to maybe build in a little bit more explicitly and talk about as we go through the stage. I'll also make a quick plug right now. We have a comment period that is open on this proceeding until October 7th for folks to comment on both the joint utilities filing for how to shorten the process to 2 years potentially, and the DPS staff filing on potential improvements to the CGPP in future cycles. If anybody wants to submit comments to that, for example, suggesting particular methods for evaluating extreme weather events, tools, models, data, anything like that, that would be a great place to put it and would be very helpful for us as well. So just anybody who wants to do that, please feel free.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I think we're good to go.
All right, thank you. So now I will get into the results of this alternate DFIR assumption case, starting with the key findings at the NICA level. So sensitivity 3 here is showing that at the NICA level, the removal of the retrofit hydrogen combustion option leads to battery storage being more economic. And that's from a capital cost perspective to serve capacity needs. And therefore more storage is built overall. And with more storage, less DFIR is required to help serve capacity needs. And this finding here in this type of battery build out was also observed in scenario 3. So it might look somewhat familiar in terms of the results here. And scenario 3 also had that fuel cell DFIR option in it. And then when it comes to the high capital, low operating DFIR option, this resource contributes a significant portion of energy. It's about 18% of the 2042 NICA-wide generation. And this is driven by its low operating cost. And it also doesn't have any sort of attachment to electrolysis or adding additional load through that mechanism there. And with this high capital, low operating option, it also provides a significant portion of energy needs, and it has a high firm capacity as a percentage of nameplate. And so that means that less resources, particularly offshore wind, UPV, and land-based wind, less of those resources are required, and that's relative to the state scenario. And this high utilization of DFIR is unique to sensitivity 3, as this was not the case in any of the other main scenarios. Another highlight here is the offshore wind capacity does not exceed the 9 gigawatt requirement per CLCPA. That's also different relative to the other scenarios where more offshore wind was needed. And in this case, the capacity limitations for land-based wind, land-based wind was limiting per the supply curve, and UPV was limiting per this annual build limit. Neither of those limitations have been reached in sensitivity 3 like they were in the other cases. So just to highlight on the DFIR side specifically in terms of capacity and energy, we wanted to pull these out up front because in some of the following slides, you will see the defer option lumped together. And this is just consistent with how we've presented all our results in the past. The defer options end up collectively in one section of our charts here. But just to level set everyone, when it comes to the installed capacity for the defers, sensitivity 3 is showing a roughly 50-50 split between the fuel cell and the high capital, low operating defer capacity. So when you see capacity numbers, just note that it's about half and half for each technology. But when it comes to the generation by defer, the high capital, low operating unit is providing 98% of that defer energy, and it's serving as more of a base load generator with close to a 99% capacity factor. You know, that is very high, but typical of resources like nuclear, as this resource is potentially representing. And the fuel cell option is only operating at 3% capacity. So in terms of energy, that's coming from the high capital, low operating resource. And we also wanted to point out a few things up front. The first one being on the electrolysis and how that compares between the state scenario and sensitivity 3. So even with the change in defer option and a reduced hydrogen demand due to less defer energy, less hydrogen defer energy contribution, there's not a significant reduction in the electrolysis demand compared to the state scenario in sensitivity 3. And that is because we do have an assumption for rest of state electrolysis. This is electrolysis needs that are outside of the electricity sector that still must be satisfied. So therefore, there's not a huge reduction in demand. And also looking at that from a peak loading perspective, again, with the slight reduction in electrolysis due to less hydrogen defer, it's not leading to a significant reduction in demand during peak periods. So in a lot of our cases, we see electrolysis demand being served in the middle of the day when the solar energy is abundant. But even as we have less defer generation, we still have the I was going to say there's still electrolysis in the middle of the day, but it looks like it is just being optimized differently in a sense that it does not lead to significant changes at peak. And that is the same case in the winter period. There's not a significant change in how the charging is being optimized. And I mean that from a sense of the magnitude. It is optimizing differently, but the magnitude is different. Okay.
Hey, Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead.
Chris, one quick question on this. Because the model is only looking at individual days versus kind of multiple day scenarios, your model assumes the energy storage can always be recharged within the same day?
Yes. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, the battery cycling does occur within the same day. So it does charge and discharge within the same 24-hour period, as opposed to anything longer than that. Does that answer your question?
And I think just to add one thing to that, in the case that we would consider this new high capital, low operating cost defer to be long duration storage, the way to interpret it that here would be that it's basically starting every day fully charged, and we're seeing what it would do during that day. And so what we're really seeing is like having something that can inject at a relatively low cost is something that the model finds extremely valuable in every single one of these representative days. Like even a relatively low load day, it's still choosing to take that energy from this high capital, low operating cost resource because it's firm and predictable and can discharge over long periods of time. And so it's picking that as opposed to building more variable renewables in the same areas with the same profiles plus associated short duration storage. So I think that's kind of the main takeaway I'm getting here is like whether this is nuclear long duration storage or linear generators or whatever, this type of high capital, low operating cost resource, the model finds extremely valuable. But you're right, when we're talking about charging, the model, there's not a specific day, representative day, or specific hour of the day that we're forcing the model to like charge the quote unquote long duration storage version of that. We're kind of missing that in this modeling framework. So to make this really represent long duration storage, we'd have to kind of string these days together. As you were mentioning, we're only seeing one day at a time. We'd have to string these days together and then see where the model chose to charge that, say, 100-hour duration resource first, and then see it offer that high capacity injection. But we're kind of missing that point.
Okay, and then just one more, a couple of follow-up questions on that, Skylar. I think Kevin mentioned it was about an 18% capacity factor for that type of resource. Is it safe to assume that if you could look at more than one day at a time, that 18% is actually a minimum value and could be much higher?
Yeah, I'll clarify one thing first. I think on that slide, it was 18% of the statewide energy by 2042, and they were operating at roughly like a 99% capacity factor, which basically means every representative day, the model found value in just grabbing this, big chunk of injection in basically every hour to avoid the need to build variable renewables and storage combined. So that's one of the takeaways is like the model seeing it as valuable in every day. But to kind of answer your question about it, how would this change if we saw this kind of strung together? It might change the decision making in the model just a bit because it might choose to ramp in different hours when the days are connected. It might choose to charge the storage during different hours. So I would expect these results to change a little bit, but not too awful much until we start representing long duration storage charging in the model as well.
Okay, and then the last question would be, by introducing this type of asset, do you then also see some changes on the T&D expansion required? Because it is a base load?
I think you just got to the heart of it. And we might see some results later that get better information on this. But yeah, even though the on slide like 23 and 24, you're seeing like the peak energy needs and the peak injections and charging, those types of things don't change much. The fact that a huge chunk of this energy can come from like one specific location without necessarily needing like lots of interconnections and lots of different local headroom would dramatically change the transmission and distribution build out needs as compared to other scenarios that are basically entirely reliant on wind and solar and storage for both energy and creating hydrogen through electrolysis to use in the DFERs. So yes, I think this is going to lead to some dramatic T&D differences.
Okay, thank you.
And Chris Wetland, this is Keith again here. You will see that if you think of the headroom as a representative for how much needs to be expanded across that transmission distribution interface, we'll have a slide on that a little bit later. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yep, thank you very much. Yeah, we've got some of that info, so keep going. We can get into it here. But starting at the highest level, at the state level, again, we're doing a comparison of the state scenario and then just sensitivity 3 here. So this is where we can see the removal of the retrofits leads to more battery storage. as it's more economic for serving capacity needs. And then with more storage, we actually need less DFIR, again, for capacity. And then here is how that looks from an energy perspective. We do see that high capital, low operating option contributing significant portion of energy. And yes, that 18% number that I was quoting is a representation of the annual generation contribution in 2042 here. And so the high capital, low operating option is generating much more in this case, driven by its low operating cost.
Yeah, and that's that top right chart. I think gets this is the first one that kind of gets to what Chris was bringing up. You know, in every other scenario we've seen so far, and the sensitivities, we're seeing somewhere on the order of 130 to 140 gigawatts of new capacity needs, and in this scenario, that drops to like 115.
Yeah, exactly, Skylar. And just looking at it from a delta perspective here, this is where we can see, you know, there is about a net decrease of 16 gigawatts of nameplate capacity. And that's largely due to the fact that this high capital operating option and the fuel cell option have high firm capacities. So they are able to serve both capacity needs and energy needs, which allows for a reduction in a lot of the other resources that we had, like solar, some wind, and even some of the DFIR. But you do have to make up for that with a little bit more nameplate battery capacity. And then that swapping of generation here, just most of the energy coming from high capital, low operating, and replacing the renewable options that we had in previous cases, and in the state scenario specifically. And then when we look at that from an upstate versus downstate perspective, in sensitivity 3, while the similar trends in terms of resource build and distribution are shown in this case, less resources are required overall, both upstate and downstate. So similar point as NICA, but now holds true in upstate and downstate. And these resources are, again, offset by that DFIR option. And this is just highlighting points I've mentioned here. And similar to the state scenario, sensitivity 3 is showing a balance of storage between upstate and downstate. And that's largely driven by the need to satisfy LCRs. So let's have a look at that. So here we can see significant reduction in upstate capacity and a reduction in downstate capacity as well. But the storage is serving capacity needs still both upstate and downstate. And then how this all looks on the zonal perspective. At that zonal level, the high capital, low operating option, you know, as a reminder, is limited to zones A through G, and the majority is built in zone G. And new fuel cells are primarily built downstate, and that's again for LCRs. And they have they have capacity built, but they are generating very little. So that kind of indicates to us that they are primarily there for those LCRs. And the addition of the high capital, low operating DFIR leads to less resources, both upstate and downstate. And that's, again, that similar point, coupling of energy and capacity. And this is where we get into the headroom. We are seeing less incremental headroom as a result of this updated case. And I'll have a figure out on that in a moment here. But looking at the zonal comparison, again, a decline in resources in a lot of these zones. Zone G is where we're seeing a lot of that high capital, low operating resource being built, and then a reduction of DFIRs downstate but some of that is made up from this battery capacity. And I have more on the DFERs coming up as well. But getting into the headroom, so sensitivity 3 showing a lot less headroom expansion in most zones. And we see that in most zones, with the exception of G, where a lot of that high capital, low operating generation ends up in sensitivity 3. And then again, showing the 4-hour versus 8-hour storage. What's really highlighted on this slide is the increase that is demonstrated in the sensitivity 3 results, both from a 4-hour and 8-hour perspective. And this is because without those hydrogen retrofits, the battery is an economic option to meet capacity requirements. And then just giving the similar perspective on the zonal DFER build by type, we do have some new colors. Instead of everything being purple, we've changed this a little bit to make it more clear. But you have your hydrogen options in the state scenario result represented by these colors here. But then we have our new hydrogen fuel cell in a light blue, and the new high capital, low operating DFER in the green. And so this is where you can see how the high capital, low operating DFER was distributed, and you can see the addition of that resource in zone G, as well as some other upstate zones in sensitivity 3 here. And with respect to energy, that's not shown here, the state scenario DFER option, those combustion resources are only operating at a 2% capacity factor, versus in this new sensitivity 3, you've got that 99% capacity factor of the high capital, low operating unit. And as seen in a couple slides, just this information is here for reference, the energy contribution is similar to that of a baseload generator. And our next figure actually highlights that with respect to all of the representative days that the model is seeing. So these are the representative days in 2042. Just to highlight, the representative days are basically what the capacity expansion model is seeing to make its build decision based on different conditions of energy as well as renewable energy output, whether it be low or medium or high. So a range of renewable conditions, as well as peak periods like summer and winter peak. But here's where we see the high capital, low operating, serving energy in that base load style, essentially, versus the state scenario where the hydrogen DFERs were mostly operating as peakers. So really only coming on in peak periods. And then finally, this last figure is just getting into a delta between these representative days slides. And we don't have every single generation technology type represented here, but this is just for us to highlight how the energy exchange is happening between the two cases, or I should be more clear, what the delta is from sensitivity 3 to the state scenario. We've got more energy from that high capital, low operating, and it's displacing the renewable options, and it also reduces some charging need and a change to electrolysis and flexible load patterns and things like this. So just wanted to highlight that. And
on this,
yeah.
Sorry, just before you go on, there's just one thing that I thought personally was a little interesting too, that in this scenario, because it does, the 4,000 to 5,000 megawatts of that high capital, low operating defer provides so much of that energy, and it's kind of predictable. It offsets a lot of that kind of marginal solar and wind, and actually leads to less intraday hydro curtailment. So that's what those little blue pieces are on the second to left and the third and fourth from the right, those little blue sections during the middle of the day. In previous scenarios, you have these huge peaks of solar power in the middle of the day, and we have so much extra energy that it's actually sometimes curtailing, at least in this modeling framework, it was curtailing some of that hydro happening during the middle of the day. But having more of this base load offsetting some of that, solar avoids those hydro curtailments.
Yes, good point, Skylar. And just to explain that a little further, is based on basically the operating cost assumptions for the various resources. And because the hydro has a higher assumed operating cost, that's why that resource curtails before, say, any of the other renewable types. So just to answer that question for folks.
Right. Renewables are competing with each other.
Yep. Are there any questions on this scenario specifically? We have a little bit more information to present, but it is more of high level, comparing everything we've seen to date. Are there any questions on this? Okay. So the last observations that we wanted to share with the group here are just some things that we had noticed, and just for everyone's consideration when it comes to all the CGPP results to date. When we compare all the scenarios that we've done so far, the NICA-wide path of renewable builds is quite similar through 2035, and the divergence is primarily occurring after 2035, and that's particularly in sensitivity 3. But we pulled some figures here to highlight this for everyone. And this is just looking at the NICA level capacity by type by CGPP scenario. So we have the state scenario, scenario 2 and 3, and then sensitivity 3. And here's, we can see at the NICA level, the capacity expansion results are within a fairly close range for a lot of these technologies. And then things start to diverge later in the model. And this is primarily for the achievement of 0 by 40. And the divergence is largely driven by, what sort of resources are available to meet that goal. And it's also a similar story at the zonal level. We're seeing similar pathways up to 2035, even at the zonal level. So in terms of energy producing resources like solar, wind, and offshore wind, we see that distribution fairly consistent. And then there is some variation in defer as well as battery, again, affected by assumptions, but quite similar here. And then the divergences, again, on the zonal level, happening in 2040 and beyond. So we just wanted to just share that. Seemed like an interesting insight, interesting finding that we could speak of to date with these results. So happy to field any questions on this if there are any. But just to close out my slides here, we are starting to present a data catalog for CGPP results to date. This includes pointing to different presentations, and if there is old presentations available on the EPAC website for like state scenario results and the other cases, if anyone is interested, as well as information from the technical conference. And with that, that concludes my presentation, but happy to take questions.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Skylar. Kevin, just one other point to your presentation. When you kind of look forward at some of your modeling does not really include like the attributes required for economic development within the state, correct? So, and the reason why I'm asking that is if all of a sudden you had 3 gigawatts of large load that showed up, that's a 24/7 requirement. The modeling isn't capturing that. It's just assuming a certain load profile. Is that safe to say?
We do have load inputs, but part of that is expected large load projects. So we do have large loads based on the 2023 Gold Book. So that is partially considered here. So does that?
I guess
right.
The point I'm trying to get to would be that if you had a large amount of new economic development that was not curtailable, that was more like 24/7 because of their operational need, that might make a defer that's multiple days more attractive because of that, and because you could attract that business to New York.
Yeah, Chris, I would agree with you there. I think, the more high capacity factor loads that you have, they're just on 24/7 new large loads. If that goes beyond the kind of baseline new economic development load forecast that we put here, which I think is somewhere around 6,000 gigawatt hours of energy over the course of the year at roughly 100% capacity factor. If we go beyond that, it does keep requiring that amount of extra firm capacity because it's basically 1-to-1. If that's energy that's needed over the course of every hour of every day, it's going to keep wanting to pull in more and more of the firm resources as opposed to trying to mix and match with the solar and wind and storage. And the one last thing I'd point out around that is that as we saw in almost all of these other sensitivities, by the time we hit 2040 and 2042, we're basically at our absolute max amount of wind and solar we could potentially deploy based on our internal constraints on headroom and build rates for those resources. So if we did have another like really big high capacity factor load come in, there's not much, we're very, very, very far down the supply curve. And there's not much extra we really could do without trying to deploy a lot of different additional storage and some amount of defer that doesn't require renewables to drive electrolysis. Because we're so far down those supply curves already, it's going to be tough to keep hitting those with the same resources. So this is where having something like this high capital, low operating cost defer to provide that type of firm capability and give us that wiggle room to have a lot of our supply curve left and a lot of our storage left to be deployed. That gives us more flexibility to hit more of those high capacity factor loads.
Thanks, Skylar.
Hi, it's Liz Cruzaro at DPS. I don't have a question. I just want to say thanks for the presentation. That was really interesting.
Agreed. Especially thanks for putting together those last few slides on kind of the trajectory of all those scenarios. Some of those scenarios, just to remind folks, those are very different. The state scenario, compared to scenario 2, scenario 2 changes the price of storage. It adds like an extra 5,000 or 10,000 megawatts of distributed PV. And then scenario 3, that basically gets rid of the combustion option for hydrogen resources across the state, gets rid of those retrofits and deploys it has a higher load forecast and deploys a ton more storage and fuel cells across the state. But when you actually look at the trajectory of how we get to that 2040 timeframe in all of these scenarios, we basically take the same path to 2035 in all of them. And then when you get really close and really tight and we start exploring those kind of longer term, you know, what we're calling DFERs, but those new technologies that might not be off the shelf today, when the model starts really making those decisions, it starts diverging rapidly. And that's something I wanted to kind of discuss here today, is that one of the biggest pieces of the CGPP is, defining those pathways that diverge in meaningful ways, in ways that are still reasonable and responsible, and having bounds, having 3 scenarios that kind of bound that potential transmission deployment. And to this point, I think we were, on the CGPP team, we were a little concerned with scenarios 1, 2, and 3. When you look at the 2035 and 2040 build out, there wasn't really a meaningful difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2, even with the slight difference in storage deployments and additional distributed PV. We were a little bit concerned about pushing that all the way through the rest of the modeling, because the total amount of builds and locations of those builds are roughly the same for the entire modeling timeframe. And it might not do a great job of providing the commission with all that extra information about what it really means to meaningfully reduce transmission investment requirements. But one of the things I think we just saw in this sensitivity 3 is that if you have these types of resources that can inject power for like a week or for an entire month or something like that over time, that can do a tremendous amount in terms of reducing the need to build those like far down the supply curve solar and wind resources in the same areas where we already have a ton, and build out all that extra local transmission and maybe even bulk transmission. A lot of that can be avoided with certain strategically placed high capacity factor resources. And so one of the things we wanted to raise today was, given the big difference that we finally did see in a scenario here in sensitivity 3, wanted to gauge some folks' reactions to potentially, I think what we were going to call it is promoting it, promoting sensitivity 3 to be one of the 3 scenarios moving through the rest of the CGPP modeling, to actually do a powerful analysis on that type of result, to do a type of stability analysis, to really come out with those solution sets of potential local and bulk transmission needs that would be meaningfully different than the state scenario or scenario 3. And we're going to see, people's thoughts on that. Anna, go ahead.
Thanks, Skylar. This is Anna Summer from Energy Futures Group on behalf of WEACT. Not to answer a question with a question, but because the differences in that sensitivity 3 were showing up later on in the study period, does that have a big impact on sort of the near-term actions, or is it more about just understanding how those transmission differences might manifest in that later portion of the study period that aligns with the difference in the capacity expansion plan?
Yeah, that was a great observation. That's a great question. Thanks. Yes, no, that's exactly it. Even in this scenario, as Kevin was just pointing out, even in that new sensitivity 3, the build out to 2035 still is roughly the same. It's very, very similar. Where it really starts diverging is that last 5-year time step. And while, just my gut reaction is that the final report that comes out of this work that is identifying like near-term investments that have to be paid for and built like urgently to get us on these pathways, I don't think we're going to be buying all the stuff we need in 2042 today in this very first report. I think we want to maintain that flexibility.
Yeah.
But I think the important piece in trying to evaluate 3 very different scenarios is that the pathway we jump on right now in these early investments, these early stages, we believe a lot in flexibility and optionality and expandability in the investments that we're trying to make. And if the trajectories are basically the same to 2035, but they diverge a lot after that. We want to make sure we're on a path that keeps all those open, at least for another cycle of the CGPP. And if we're not evaluating something that is this different, I'm just personally a little bit concerned that we might miss a turn or something, or we might, have to approve projects or evaluate projects that are not necessarily expandable in the certain direction that might enable one of these potential futures. So it's mostly about information and optionality, as opposed to literally just trying to compare the investments required in 2040 for each of the scenarios.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, I mean, I feel like this is a really common tension in grid planning where, and everybody says that they don't want to let the model dictate outcomes, but nobody has an alternative about how you would go
Yeah.
getting those outcomes. And so sometimes you do have to rely on kind of heavy-handedness to produce a different outcome to evaluate. So I have no objection to that in principle. I guess as we've gone through these slides, the thing that I realized I don't totally understand is what those additional transmission needs are, and maybe this is something to ask you offline. But the headroom values that were defined in I think it was a presentation that I actually didn't attend because it was before I joined EPAC. Gave current values across different conditions, like summer peak and winter peak and things like that. And so I'm not sure which values from those presentations I'm comparing to these charts here, and not entirely clear about how much headroom is being added in each one of the investment years, because again, we're talking about transmission and not about generation that's being added to the system, if that makes sense.
Yes, and that's actually a pretty complicated decision the model's making. When we entered those headroom values into the model, we're entering the ones that are most binding. So the model is just really saying, like, in whatever that headroom limitation, whichever limitation is actually binding on the headroom, that's when we would need to add another megawatt of headroom capacity to the model to enable that future. So it's not that those headroom numbers represent the summer peak coincident headroom requirements across the whole state. It's that in different areas, different headroom is binding. Like, so different headroom values, like for summer versus winter versus low load, different ones are binding and would need to be alleviated with new headroom to allow the build out that we have. And so it's going to take, those were just conceptual costs with high level headroom numbers. And that's why, picking a certain scenario that is different is going to be really important in future stages, because the utilities are going to be doing the more granular local analysis to identify exactly where and when those types of upgrades would be necessary, and tell us which ones actually are needed and what those actually cost. Because they're not all going to cost, $389 a kilowatt. And then increase by exactly 15% each kind of unit, So we're going to have to flow that through and find that out. And that's one of the keys here, is trying to identify ones that might build a different amount of headroom in different areas. So we see the different projects that wouldn't be required, because those are really what makes the futures of kind of the transmission system different.
So if I wanted to know which of those headroom numbers was binding, could I just, like, let's say I'm looking at investment year 2030, could I round down and, let's say zone A to whatever the closest headroom number is from that presentation?
Yeah, I think there is data on that. I think there's data on how much available headroom there is today, and then how much is needed to be added in each zone in those given years. I think that data is available on previous presentations.
Okay, maybe, okay. Well,
Yeah, so this is Keith from the NISO. You can go back to any of the I provide a link in that data dictionary to go back and look at any of the 3 scenarios, state scenario, scenario 2, or scenario 3, or even our tech conference provides the numbers that were utilized for the existing headroom by zone and how much additional headroom was built by the model in each zone for the state scenario, scenario 2, and scenario 3. And you can combine this with the other presentations like the one we just gave on how much headroom is added or reduced compared to the state scenario from those. So the information's all there.
Thanks, Keith. So you said that link is given in the slides. It was the
the last slide where we say like, hey, you can go look at these 3 things, or I think the one where you can look at all of them together is the tech conference on the headroom. It's somewhere around slide 39-ish, slide 40 towards the end, where we get the headroom existing versus incremental across the 3 main scenarios.
Okay, great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and if you want to shoot me an email, I can send you any links you need.
Okay, thanks, Skylar.
Go ahead, Chris.
Real quick, Skylar, to your question, I think it makes sense to maintain the flexibility of including that scenario. Your modeling shows some cost improvement on the T&D side, which is good for the consumers. It also shows a high capacity factor, non-carbon unit that would be operating. And then just because the modeling itself is somewhat limited in that you're looking at single days, you possibly add some economic value down the road, as well as when you talk about extreme weather, that it could provide some benefits there as well. So I think it makes sense to at least keep it now. You go to the next cycle and you can consider it again when you get through the next cycle.
Yeah, I think that's the hope. Just keep improving, trying to improve the representation of each of these individual potential resources so we can really see more granularly what those benefits are of each type of build out.
It's Liz. I just want to add to Skylar, what Skylar said. I think, from kind of a non-technical perspective, this is our first time that we've asked the JU to do this. And, we're going to have to, the case for any particular set of transmission investments is going to have to be pretty strong, given that this is a new process, given the uncertainties, given, how many things we're going to want to revisit in the next cycle. So, I'm to echo something that Tyler said, we're not expecting to buy everything that we need between now and 2042 out of this round.
And I know we only have 10 minutes left, but just want to give folks one last chance to, give some feedback on what they think about the promotion idea. Yeah, I think we're all learning as we're going, and we didn't really know how different all these build outs would be until we ran the model. And I know we scoped 3 quote unquote base scenarios, but sometimes the model doesn't give you significantly different results under different scenarios. So these sensitivities have been really valuable to us. So we'll keep that option open. I think we will try to maybe push that forward as a formal idea here over the next few days. The one last wrinkle I want to throw onto that, though, is that we did find out that we had forgotten to put, and this was totally on us, on the staff team who was presenting the data inputs for this. We did not have any deltas or differences in deployment costs for the A to E versus F and G type resources in that model run, whereas we do for other types of resources. And so what we want to do here is to rerun this same sensitivity 3, all the same parameters, but add those types of regional cost differences back into the model, along with potentially a supply constraint on some of those like zones F and G, so we can get kind of a more realistic build out. Because as you recall in the slides we just went through, as the results that Kevin presented today showed like 4.5 gigawatts of these high capacity factor resources going into zone G. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with the zones, how the zones map to geography in New York State, zone G is kind of like the Hudson Valley. And so we were just a little bit concerned that without those extra downstate constraints and supply constraints that we usually use for other resources, the model may have overbuilt in that one specific area, as opposed to if we had those other supply constraints. So what we want to do is to kind of basically do that exact same model run that we just did and presented in sensitivity 3, but rerun it again with those constraints and see what the model gives us. And so we'll be coming back at a future EPAC and showing those results too. I'm not expecting them to really change too awful much, but we just wanted to be extra accurate, because once we do kind of, if we do promote these to a scenario that runs through the rest of the CGPP, the actual kind of zonal locations are going to be important, because the utilities have to translate that into their networks and into their systems. And if we have it all concentrated in one zone like zone G, as opposed to spread out a little bit more based on the cost of deployment, we might get different results, and we want to be sure we're doing something that's kind of practical and more realistic. And so that's something we're going to be running on as just a small tweak to that sensitivity here over the next couple of weeks. So that was two of the main things. I think I only had one more thing to talk about today, and that was kind of next steps. This has come up a couple times through the questioning, and yes, we are moving forward on the one sensitivity Radhika mentioned, where in addition to relaxing the bulk constraints, we'll be relaxing the headroom constraints as well, to see if that gives us a lot more flexibility on where and how much resources are cited. I think that sensitivity is also removing the build rate limitations, so that if the model needs to build it in an earlier year but was restricted based on the build rate, it can do that now in that next sensitivity. So that'll be, I think, what we're calling sensitivity 4. That'll be coming soon, and we'll have another EPAC meeting shortly to go over those results. There was another sensitivity that was mentioned again, I think by Julia earlier, as a distinction from the sensitivity 3 we just did. There's another one that we're also scoping right now, that is that no downstate defer, I think is what we called it in our sensitivity spreadsheet that was passed around through the EPAC the last few weeks. That would be like another sensitivity, but we would be off of scenario 3. And that scenario 3, remember, that has the higher load, no hydrogen combustion, only fuel cells. But it will be a sensitivity, this new sensitivity will be off of that scenario, but will restrict any hydrogen infrastructure from going into downstate. And so that's something that we're scoping right now. We just have to put a couple last tweaks on that before we can hit run. But that'll kind of give us another iteration of that scenario 3 to look at. And hopefully we'll have that at a future EPAC as well. You'll probably be seeing some emails from me over the next week or so, because we do have a few sensitivities to work with still. And based on what we're learning here, it might be sparking some new ideas in the CGPP team and the rest of the EPAC. So please look out for those emails and provide any other feedback that you have on this process around these sensitivities, and we'll be happy to consider that over the next few weeks. We do hope to kind of wrap this stage 1, because yes, it's been a year and a month and we are still in stage 1 of CGPP, but it's our first time, and we think getting these things right for our first really major transmission investment consideration through CGPP is really important. So we're taking our time, and really appreciate the NYISO sticking with us through this whole thing. But all that being said, we do want to wrap this up as soon as we can over the next a few weeks to month. And so what we're trying to move quickly to identify those last sensitivities, so we can run that model and kind of put the capacity expansion modeling to bed, so we can move into some of the more granular modeling runs that will educate us on a lot of the questions that were asked today about kind of those power flow issues or the extreme weather type stuff. And we'll schedule some more EPAC meetings throughout that later stages of the process as well, to keep everybody informed. So that was a lot. Does anybody have any questions before we close? All right.
Carol,
well,
maybe one,
yeah.
sorry,
Oh, go
maybe
ahead.
one question. The state scenario will not be changed. You are discussing promoting sensitivity number 3 to one of the scenarios. Would that be, are you saying, so maybe two questions on that particular topic. Are you saying that would be in addition to the low transmission and high transmission scenarios? Or would this sensitivity number 3 replace one of the two scenarios?
Oh, yes. Thanks for the question. So the way we're trying to lay this out is kind of a bounding analysis. This was kind of a decision we made early on to try to craft these three scenarios that are likely to produce lower investment needs, average needs, and then higher investment needs. What this new sensitivity 3 is kind of showing is a lot less headroom and potentially a lot fewer transmission upgrade constraints because they're potentially sited in large quantities in certain areas. And so that would likely result in less of that local transmission investment and potentially bulk transmission investment. So we are leaning towards, since it's potentially lowering those investment needs, it would replace the quote unquote low transmission scenario, which was scenario 2. And so that's the concept now, is it would be kind of like a swap. Scenario 2 still exists. We have all the data, but in terms of what actually goes through, power flow modeling, stability analysis, and solutions development, this would be something a little bit more different than the state scenario. So it gives us a kind of a bigger boundary to kind of interpret. So it wouldn't be in addition to, it would be kind of a swap out of scenario 2.
Thank you for the clarification. The second question on the build out, the zonal build out and stage 2, there was a question discussed in prior EPAC calls about sharing where new generators will be added at which particular substations. So I was wondering if that information will be provided at some point if the models are complete.
Yeah, I think I think we're calling it the quote unquote little s, siting methodology, where the zonal generation quantities are placed at individual node, like local sections of the utility networks. That methodology has been defined, like you said, and I think we did on a previous EPAC call discuss, I think someone from the utilities want to jump in. I think we did say that's something we probably would have. It would probably be aggregated because we're not placing like actual real life generators necessarily. It's like megawatts of certain resources. So it would say, how much of the zone E wind from the model, there's like 1,000 megawatts of wind in zone E, 400 megawatts gets placed here. That's information that we will have. And I'm not sure at what level we're able, with the various data restrictions, how much we're able to share out from the utilities modeling, but I'm sure we will try to share as much of that as possible so you all can see how that zonal is being translated to nodal. I think that's just good practice, but anyone from the utilities know how those steps are working and what type of data might be available to share?
Hey, Scott, it's Jeff Marr from National Grid. We're still working with our consultant to build the base cases from the state scenario. So we're still working through the process of citing these resources into the nodal power flow models. So we don't have the data yet. Once we get it, we're not quite sure how best to share it. We can take that back and think about it.
Okay, sounds good. So the model's still kind of being built out, but there is obviously going to be some form of representation where like megawatts are showing up electrically on the system, and you'll have that data, and we'll just have to figure out how to share it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So more to come on that, Radhika. I mean, we haven't even decided which full 3 scenarios are moving through that process, but we are going to have that data, and we'll find a way to share the useful pieces.
Thank you.
In the future, yeah. All right, so we are at 4, so I'm going to close the call. As always, just feel free to shoot emails or anything you need, or comments or anything to the EPAC email address, or me. You know where to find me. Thanks everybody for joining, and much more to come. We'll see you in the next few weeks. Make sure to pay attention to your emails and the DPS matter, when we schedule the next EPAC meeting. It should be in the next couple weeks. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.